little earlier. And I will also be talking about this question of pedagogy that Dr. Petkar also talked about, and to what extent the classroom is changing, and the approaches to pedagogy with technology can undergo a transition. And what I'll fundamentally do is also to take a look at my experiments, because you see, what I can talk about is how I have been dealing with the problem, and I'll be very glad to hear your responses and your ways of coping, especially now that we have a CBCS syllabus, which again becomes a very important part of our teaching process, and the changes that we can incorporate within that given tight structure. So this is what is the fundamental premise of my presentation. Now, transitions I need not explain, I guess, but the term aporia, and it's very correctly identified that, I've been using this in the sense that Roman Jakobson uses it, and later on as Jacques Derrida will use it. I use this term to talk about this kind of entering into a kind of a border state, a liminal state where I'm at a loss, at a kind of impossible juncture where we are all rushing headlong into a practice, but also are inclined to doubt and raise objections, and facing a kind of a difficulty. And that last quotation is from Derrida, of course, the point of undecidability, which locates the site at which the text most obviously undermines its own rhetorical structure, dismantles or deconstructs itself. So as I was listening to the concluding remarks made by Dr. Petkar, and he was suggesting certain ways and strategies of incorporating technology, and I heard my old friend Ritiman talking about whether the teacher would disappear or would be there, how would he be there, to what extent would technology come in. I am at that aporetic space, really, the gaps and fissures, which I would like to subtly probe in this presentation. And once again, I am suggesting that these are largely my own formulations, and this is not prescriptive at all. This is the ranting of a confused man who's thrown in the same boat as you are. Given that my university is a semi-rural university, most of my students do not have access to much technology. So how can I cope? Now, the questions that I shall be asking, this is just to keep myself in some kind of a check so that I don't ramble, on and on. What does teaching literature mean in the present times? What will be our approaches? And this is very important, because what Indian contexts do we bring, especially in a CBCS syllabus? Now, this has been a bone of contention in our department. Literature departments, especially English literature departments, are gradually realizing that we cannot really teach just English literature, and that one or two papers of regional literatures, Commonwealth literatures does not suffice until and unless we can relate literature teaching with our daily existences, with our realities. Teaching of English literature becomes really very problematic. It's dead white men writing only, which holds little meaning for somebody who does not know what a daffodil is, but who would rather, or see a mustard flower and understand what a daffodil could be. Yes. Now, what do we retain? That's a question which many of the participants I saw asking. How does the classroom change? What is the role of the teacher? How do we accept technology? So the concurrent question is, how do we accept technology, and how does one cross the digital divide? This is becoming a very, very critical question for all of us. Given that the digital divide is a very, very real phenomenon, how does one cross this? What does this new teaching mean for the margins? And when I'm talking about the margins, I'm talking also about the disabled, because so far, within the pandemic, this is a category of people who have largely been ignored or completely disregarded by the vast majority of people. What has this meant for the library? So my daughter has just crossed her 12th and is entering into, is just being admitted into a college in Kolkata. So I can see really the ways in which 20 years earlier, when I went to college for the first time, what the library meant to me and what it means now. How has reading changed? And how does one integrate this into our daily teaching, this question of the library and the digital archive? My examples will be from the teaching of 18th century and the rape of the lock, which I teach. And I presume most of you will do, this being the CBCS third semester, and this being a text as part and parcel of this. That is why I've taken a text which is very live to all of us. How does one redesign a syllabus and bring one's agency? UGC has given us a prescription, wham, bam, bam. These are the things that are there. So how does one bring that change in? And how does one create a digital footprint? What are the pitfalls of this? This is my maiden foray into YouTube. I'll be discussing the problems that I'm facing with you, and I'm sure many of you are already doing this. So I come to you not as somebody who has answers and is a doctor with a prescription. I come to you as somebody who shares your problems and is struggling equally. Now, I would also want to talk about Lyotard a bit. This, of course, you can realize and recognize is the essay where Lyotard asks an answer to the question, what is postmodernism? And he talks, there's a very interesting section where he talks about the techno-sciences, which becomes, he says, a means of increasing disease and not fighting it. And he questions as to whether this technology is really, can be called by the old name of progress, and suggests a very interesting term. I remember, this is because just I recognize him, talking to Dhritiman once upon a time at Malda about what it meant to be progressive. And this is a very interesting term that Lyotard used. He says that technology is now gaining a kind of a motricity. That means it is becoming independently mobile, and that we do not have any more control over it. And human entities seem always to be destabilized by the results of this development. Right. And therefore, there's this very interesting comparison that he makes that, and you can see the cursor here, we are in this techno-scientific world, he says, like Gulliver. Sometimes too big, sometimes too small. As fancy, Lyotard, the postmodernist, going back to that archetypal 18th century text, Gulliver's Travels, and suggesting that we are like either in Lilliput or in Brobdingnag, in relationship to technology. And keep that at the back of my mind. I'm just building a theoretical apparatus through which I can come to the teaching of literature. Now, I will suggest, of course, that the method that we are also indulging in, and we should, is comparative cultural poetics. Right, we are talking about comparative cultural studies rather than comparative literature. Please remember that as teachers of English literature, we are always into a comparative mode. Now, there are very few of us who teach literature purely in English, right? We have to, given the constraints of the classroom, periodically talk in another language also. And I think that's not a detriment at all. My thesis is that it is to be encouraged, and it is to be nurtured and properly motivated. But I'm also not talking about language. I'm also talking about other texts, other forms of textuality. Now that we have cultural studies, we are enmeshed in a world where the internet is at hand, where we have access to visual realities, we have access to paintings, we have access to music. Therefore, my point is that what globalization and the internet has done is given us a plethora of resources. The problem is not with the lack of resources. Now, the problem is with the abundance of resources. Now, what are we going to do with these resources is my question. And that is why I'm talking about comparative cultural studies, where you actually in literature need to redefine the nature of the text and the interactions between high cultures and popular cultures. Now, my friends will immediately say, we do have a paper on detective fiction as part of the comparative, as part of the CBCS curriculum, or a paper on popular literature. Why don't I sort of put that as part of the course and forget all about it? Then comes this question of methodology, because, you know, we are also literature teachers. We teach texts in greater detail. Therefore, the lack of methodology of cultural studies cannot be our lack. And we need to have a combination of comparative reading practices and the rigor of area studies. Now, when I talk about comparative cultural studies, what am I actually talking about? I'm talking about a field of study where selected tenets of the discipline of comparative literature are merged with selected tenets of the field of cultural studies, meaning that the study of culture and cultural products, including but not restricted to literature, communication, media, art, etc. Now, why do students study English literature is a fundamental question that most of you are asking. Very few of them will actually go into researches. Most of them will go into either teaching at school, where literature doesn't matter, language does, or they will branch out into professions where, you see, they will not be dealing with literary texts, but social media, painting, advertising, visual media, etc., etc. So has the time come when we need to figure this into our teaching of literature as well? Because, you know, we're looking just at a kind of a colonial teaching of English literature. You remember Macaulay and his minutes, whereby the entire discipline was established. We're just carrying this legacy onwards in a certain way. In this context, as my former speaker was talking about, how does one integrate literature with other forms of cultural textuality? Now, interestingly, many of you are dealing with the concept of diaspora, and diasporic studies is part of your course of study. How would I have gone about it? And since I have written and spoken extensively about it, taught it in classes, now I would, of course, talk about a combination of the archival resources. This, by the way, is an indentured bond of the indentured Indian laborer. And you will note that it is written in Bengali, of the coolies or the indentured laborers who went off to Mauritius. This has been a course of study for me for some time, which I've incorporated in my syllabus as well. These are the archives and the visual resources. Now, one of the things which I would like you to think is, how does a visual text work? I mean, say, when you read literature, you read within the lines, you read for meaning, but you can quickly figure things out. But for a text of visual culture, reading the text is a difficult process in which we need to be also trained. And you see, for example, reading a painting is something we need to train ourselves in. So that is something which I would like to talk about slightly later, but this is where the archive comes in. And this is where the digital humanities becomes a very crucial resource. These are now available through the digital humanities. So we need a digital archive which is accessible by all and sundry, and which we can utilize without major structural fusses. Now, I will show you one such resource and talk about it very briefly. Of course, theory then comes in a very big way. How are we going to talk about theory to the people, to the students, to the undergraduate students especially? How are we going to talk about Bhaba and liminality? This is another question. And of course, then comes literary text. You can see that I'm talking about the Jahaji Bhai as a kind of a part of a course and bringing in texts. For example, one would be, the text of Amitav Ghosh, and the other would be a text of Peggy Mohan called Jahajin. This is a relatively lesser known text, but a text written by women. And then again, you see, every single syllabus that we design has to bring in these components of different voices. We have our syllabuses and even the CBCS syllabus very heavily loaded in favor of the male voice, the male patriarchal voice. No wonder that our society is looking at a culture of rape. In even our narratives, in our stories that we tell, there is hardly any presence of the woman. And therefore, what I'm suggesting is that whenever a syllabus is designed, this has to be brought in. Now remember, when you talk about a CBCS syllabus, you have a margin of a 30 percentile where you can make changes. And at Vishwabharati and also at many other universities, our focus has always been to bring in Indian components within these 30 percentile that we have. I'll give you examples where we can do that. Now, and I'm asking, people in the various parts of the country. I heard that there are people from Kashmir, for example, the people from the South. I'm asking that translations of these texts be incorporated whenever we can into a text of the CBCS. So I am asking that English literature as we know it be broadened. There might be a 70 percentile of English literature since we give them a degree, but until and unless we change our approach and relate it to our realities, then English literature becomes largely something which students will just listen to and forget at the drop of a hat. And of course, our researches therefore will be largely skewed. Now this, of course, is a Mauritian author called Abhimanyu Unnath, whose very famous novel, Lal Pasina, talks about 3 generations of indentured laborers in Mauritius. My argument is, why shouldn't this be part of a literature course on diaspora? Why should we only talk about Arundhati Roy and we should talk about other writers whose realities we will, or the bulk of our students will never relate to? This is rather something which, ancestors have taught us was the reality. Now, of course, there's also other texts, for example, and this is where the teaching of literature becomes very interesting. For example, the autobiography of Munshi Rahman Khan. Now, once again, in a course on diaspora, why should we only read novels? Why not read other forms of writings as well? You see, what I'm asking all of us to do is, even if we can't include this in the syllabus, to make people aware of the forms of writing that can also contribute to an understanding of the situation from a context that is indigenous, from a context that is necessarily post-colonial. However much we talk about post-coloniality and write papers on it, our mentality in designing syllabi and in teaching has largely remained colonial. We merely mimic the technologies and the realities that have been created in the West. Now, for example, this is Peggy Mohan, who's incidentally a teacher who's a professor in a Delhi college, who writes about Caribbean realities, which once again are realities which are associated with ours. This novel, incidentally, is called Jahajin. You can check that out. One of the most fascinating diasporic novels that I've ever read. Peggy Mohan talks about, a village of diasporic people where every single woman is known by the same name. Say that's Chameli. And there's this story about the Uran Kotola, which all of them share. Now, it's very interesting to see how folk tales travel. And the folk tale, the Indian folk tale of the Uran Kotola, becomes that Jahajin ship, the Jahaj, which brings the diasporic individual to a new reality. And in this new reality, all of them are Chamelis because their pasts are exhausted, their pasts are erased in a certain way. Therefore, this becomes, I think I would argue that we need to incorporate these voices of women, of the indentured coolies, written by the descendants of them into diasporic literature in Hindi and translated necessarily into English. And this could also be, a way of, I am arguing, putting in a different perspective of literature, where in the process of translation, the student, say you give him or her the responsibility of translating one part of a Hindi novel into English. That becomes the internal assessment. And it is in this process of translation that you take a feedback of what he realizes. As my former speaker was talking about, this is how interactivity also increases. And that has nothing to do with technology. This is something which we can do very easily, even while using technology, Google Meet, for example. Right. I also would urge you to take a look at other forms of textuality and bring them as part of the syllabus. When I talk about hybridity, why not talk about, in diaspora, why not talk about a Fijian bhajan? A Fijian bhajan which uses the music of India, but the lyric which is unique to Fiji, right? It is in Hindi, but it talks about Ram and their transfer to an apparent Ramdes, which turns out to be an illusion. The bhajan format and the Fijian diasporic reality. Or for example, take this. This is a very well-known singer of soca music in the Caribbean, which is a fusion, once again, of Caribbean music and Indian music. So a true hybridity that operates in music. Many of you have heard this song. I'm an awful singer, so I won't even try singing it. Om Shanti Om, Om Shanti Om. Right, that song, by the way, is a copy of this soca. Right, so it's interesting in the way in which costume-wise, dance-wise, music-wise, you see, here is a Caribbean man who is incorporating in elements of music, and that is what the diasporic reality is all about. Why will that music not be part of my syllabus? Why will I just restrict myself to literary texts? Is a fundamental question that I'm asking. Now that I've got the internet at my fingertips, why won't my concept of text and literature change? That was the concept of the text. Now let me talk very briefly about the concept of reading. And here I have the concept of reading and the medieval, where you have a desexualized figure. You don't know whether this is a man or a woman. You have that printed book, which is very, very inaccessible only to the clergy. And you can see the light that sort of is transmitted from the pages of the book to the face of the reader. So reading only for the sake of profit and reading only for the sake of religious learning. Take a look also at Greuze's painting of the father reading the Bible. And so therefore, one book read by the entire family. Why am I showing all this? Principally because I want to understand the historical realities which have changed the processes of reading. And I'm arguing that to understand what today reading means, needs to be understood in the context of what reading meant at a particular time. So why is this reality very urgent? Because the father can buy just one book, right? And therefore that is the Bible, and that Bible becomes a kind of a source of a magic circle where the family congregates to learn. Therefore reading associated with learning. Then comes the novel, and this is where popular print culture explodes. What we recognize till the 1980s as print culture, reading for pleasure. Right, this is where you read so that you have you have varieties of reading material. You read so that you can have instruction, you have pleasure, and the entire variety of news. And now comes digital reading. This is the logo, of course, of the Kindle reader, which all of you know about. You read very frequently on the Kindle. But what does the Kindle mean? The Kindle fundamentally means that the physical book has disappeared. And that, therefore, you can carry a library with you. It is a positivity as well. And you can also see how gradually the book is disappearing from our lives, in the sense that with Wikipedia, with different resources, with online editions being available, and of course, with the library dwindling, reading is a phenomenon that is vanishing from our lives. Now, how do you make the student read the text? How does one make the student read the text? I happen to teach text like Tom Jones, which you shudder, to think that, students will even read, or say Tristram Shandy, or say The French Lieutenant's Woman. Those of you who teach Dickens, how many of your students actually read the novel? Do they rather go through Wikipedia? Do you just take a look at the plot? So what do you do as a teacher? What are your strategies? I'll tell you what I can do. Very often we just show films. But then that's a problem again. Because when you show a film, you don't know to what extent is it faithful. So you can give them an idea of the plot, but you can't give them a taste of the language of the period. So what I've tried to do nowadays is I assume that students won't read. If they read, it's a bonus for me. I make an abridged version of the text myself. Say I reduce it to, say, 18, 20, 32 pages, and take up the textual sections that I would like them to read. So I am giving them a kind of abridged version of the text and asking them to read that portion so that I can use them while teaching. I realize this is not a foolproof system. Some of you must be frowning in disapproval, saying this man is nuts. He's sort of asking students not to read the entire novel. But you see, after 22 years of teaching, I'm sure many of you share my predicament and my experience. Many of you are even more senior to me. You will argue that it is very important to bring the student to the text rather than allow them to just skim through certain Wikipedia passages. So reading and the library, my librarian tells me that footfalls to the library have drastically fallen, that most of them come there to access the internet and to enjoy the air conditioning. I don't know whether this is true for all universities. I guess it is. My students would be no exception. But this is how, again, you can actually try and send them parts of the text and force them to read. Nowadays, I've taken to projecting texts on the screen when I discuss a particular passage or I read a particular novel. I am gradually also moving away from just showing films and assuming that the text is read. Now, there are certain problems of undergraduate teachings which you have faced, but I'll sort of list them nevertheless. The issue of language. I don't know whether you face this. I am sure you do. issues with the understanding the milieu of the poem. I just gave you a reference. The daffodils means nothing to my students unless I can, show them what a daffodil is. How does one do a close reading of the text and get their interest? Because you see, you have to understand that in our age, our understanding of reality was filtered through reading, because we did not have this saturation by social media. One of my areas of interest has been to talk to psychologists and psychiatrists and to see how the brain now functions, or the brain now processes reality. And they tell me, and this is proved by empirical result, that the average youngster from the age of 3 onwards now handles a mobile phone, and that the processing of all his information is via the visual medium. So when one reads a text, or when one teaches literature, one has to willy-nilly fall back upon that visual medium. So what happens to a close reading of the text? And then comes this question of how does one introduce theory? So this is another very important question, because for an undergraduate student to understand theory is something which is slightly problematic, if not hugely problematic. Very often, I found out that we teach ourselves rather than our students. I myself am famous for closing my eyes while teaching. My better students say that, or the students who like me say that I am very concentrated. Students who do not like me say that sir says whatever we don't understand. So he closes his eyes so that he does not have to face the reality. Anyways, how does one resolve these issues to this discussion of the rape of the lock? If you want, I can send you a PowerPoint and my resources that I've garnered. That's the caveat. This is my own approach. I use images. I use images a lot, but I don't use random images. I choose my images very carefully. The second is something that I allow all my students to compulsorily do. I ask them, and this is before the pandemic, to record lectures. Now, this started with a physically challenged, visually challenged student called Fazle Alam, who started this process of recording classes because he could not take notes. I found out it to be a very interesting medium for allowing students to force them to once again get back to those lectures. I have used theory through objects and plays. I'll show you how in a moment. And all resources I take from the public domain. So the question is, you must not take a resource or use a resource which the student cannot access, right? In my case, for example, I have taken Gemier's edition of 1714 of the Rape of the Lock. Now, very often I use concepts through visuals. For example, this is Hogarth's analysis of beauty, and you can see this particular image, which I show as a symbol of the Augustan literature. This is the Serpentina within a pyramid, and I explain this by saying that you can have deviations, but it must be enclosed within the structure and form of neoclassicism. Now, when I talk to them about this image, I somehow see that this image captures their fancy and they remember things about neoclassicism in a better way. I, of course, can't show you the entire lecture on neoclassicism, but I'm sure you will devise your own strategies. Now, this, of course, is Blake, and you can see Urizen holding the world with a compass. Now, this is my way of moving on from neoclassicism to romanticism, right? And this is where I see the transitions happening in the way in which the critique of reason and the critique of scientific constriction into form sort of gets ruptured by the romantic imagination. I have a separate presentation on romanticism through images, which of course I can't bring in here, But let me say that I do this with 25 paintings from the Romantic period. And I found out that introducing a period with quotations, say, from major critics, concepts from major critics, textual quotations from Wordsworth, interspersed with visual images, works much better. And I incorporate, say, Mozart's symphonies within that lecture to understand what the Romantic concept would mean for music. Now, it is this what I'm trying to understand. If I have to teach literature in a comparative cultural studies format, then all these medium must also be incorporated into the practice of teaching. And this is what I'm trying to do as an experiment, and I'm asking or urging you to try and experiment in the same way. Now, of course, let me quickly go through how these images become important. Now, this becomes my entry into Pope when I talk about Pope, and then I go on and ask the question that I.A. Richards once asked in his Practical Criticism, and then later on followed by Barth and the others, is the author relevant? Now, this is the moment when I can enter into this entire debate about the author, right? And tone it down. I take concepts from Barth and Foucault, but then I try and bring it down to The Rape of the Lock as to whether the poem means anything within the context and without the context. Why does one read the poem? Does it read for the, is it read for the satire? Is it read because it offers us any questions about the status of the woman, about the anxieties that we have of a feminine Amazonian quality? These are questions, you can ask, keeping Barth somewhere in the background, but the text somewhere in the foreground. This, I remember I'm talking about the undergraduate teaching that most of us are doing. Right. Now, and then again, I ask questions about the mock heroic, and I take particular segments there, which passages become important for answering this question. I talk about Arabella Fermor, and I talk about this concrete woman, and I talk about Arabella Fermor as a representative of femininity, as a representative of the various ways in which men have looked at the feminine as hysterical or as flirtatious or as combative, right? Therefore, I bring in the various, ways in which the nymph is used, the salamander is used, for example, in The Rape of the Lock. I talk about aristocracy and the context, and you can see I am using a passage from the bedchamber, and I am showing them the realities of the 18th century bedchamber. Remember, all these resources are in the public domain. So if need be, I provide them the resources, I provide them the photographs, the paintings. I then move on to talk about narcissism and the toilet scene. And I talk about the moral muddle on Belinda's dressing table. I talk about why the mirror becomes important. What is this fetishism that is associated with looking at the woman, the concept of the gaze. So, you see, what happens is when the visual medium comes in, I'm suggesting that from the black and white of the text, you suddenly widen the range of interest and criticality of the student. Because when you talk about the gaze, you really don't get. But when you show them a mirror and you show the ways in which the narcissism and the gaze operates, then you are provoking them in a way in which their mind is wired. That is what I'm arguing, right? We talk about Belinda and Clarissa and the role of Clarissa and the concept of class consciousness and how, class, how, the woman is not just, gender is not just one uniform category, but permeated and intersected with questions of class. This allows me then to launch into another theoretical discussion. I talk about the dressing table as a space of colonialism where ivory, coffee, where the gems become representative of a celebration of colonialism. This is where I bring in Gulliver's Travels and show how the same theme of colonialism becomes critically attacked in another text. So once again, these images become very important. And I talk about how the sacred, the profane, and the political come together in The Rape of the Lock. When I talk about this entire concept of the toilet, using the snuff boxes and the canes as example, I talk about the journey by the barge and why this becomes important in the poem, about the division between the Catholics and the Protestants, and how Pope is banished into Twickenham. I talk about the silks and their fitting in, and how the satire is broadened from Belinda to a larger satire on women in general, and try and tell them why they should read The Rape of the Lock, not just as a 1712 satire written to resolve a quarrel between two families, but a satire which treats the male anxieties about the woman and the way in which texts frame the woman. Now, this is what then starts appealing to them, and we ask questions about how modern, or how the films that they watch, how the serials that they operate are, or what their social media experiences tell them about the way in which the woman is framed. I then play a game of Ombre with them. I don't have the cards with me now, but I actually play the game of Ombre. Now, if you play this game, remember, you will give them an idea of how Pope is treating a very serious question of rape, because this is the rape of the lock, remember, and the lock of hair is just a metonymic representation of the female body and its violation, and how through these metaphors of the game, we are making rape almost a commonplace incident. Now, the rape culture, obviously, that we are all shuddering at is not something, therefore, I urge them to think, that comes from a particular, deviant personality, but something which we inculcate within ourselves when we frame a woman as we do in themselves. And we try to understand how, sexual violence is very casually grafted within the ways in which our narratives frame our societies, from the fairy tales that we understand to the texts that we read. And then, of course, we talk about the climactic moment and how the exchange becomes important, how the aristocracy dwindles, and how the merchant class starts getting in importance. This leads me on to other 18th century texts as well. For example, the Spectator papers bringing in Sir Andrew Freeport and Sir Roger de Coverley, and how the exchange and the aristocrat both become important in the 18th century. This is, of course, part of my syllabus. I talk about the cave of spleen, for example, in the way in which we associate the woman with hysteria, right? And how, the female body and its menstrual impulses are gradually sort of seen as a lack of control, and how again the woman is framed as somebody who is lunatic, who is hysterical, who is not in control over herself, and how reason is male and emotion and excessive emotion is female. So this, these images help us in getting into nooks and corners of discussions. Of course, given the limitations of time, but as Professor Pedkar, I heard him say that we are facilitators, aren't we? We should not only teach them what the text means and prepare them to write answers, but also to generate a degree of critical thinking. And I'm suggesting that this critical thinking can best be done through images. And then I talk about the how Belinda, this is always where the text comes parallel to the image. It's a contrapuntal method that we select images, we project the text onto it, and therefore they are being read continuously and contrapuntally. This is where the pedagogy comes in a very big way. And then, of course, this vision of the Amazonian woman, and I talk about the wife of Bach and how, this figure of the combative, militant woman is progressively derided by patriarchy and continually dismissed. I talk about the receptions of the poem, of course, and the way in which various generations have seen the poem. I talk about passive femininity, the speech of Clarissa, and I talk about the patriarchal fantasy. And then that leads me on to probably giving them an assignment on Jane Eyre and giving somebody an assignment on the big mad woman in the attic. Now, one of the things which you might try, and this is my request, is now that we have Google Meet and students are adapting to it, it is always very useful to take 4 classes and then try and ask somebody to make a presentation on Google Meet, if possible. And I've come up with students who are very hesitant. I allow them to speak in a mix of Bangla and English in my case, because I'm teaching in a Bengali locality. Of course, if there's somebody who is in English who does not understand Bengali, I translate it for her. But to get them into the process of thinking and presentation, I think is a wonderful thing that technology allows us to do. I then talk about the theories, the theory of the game, for example, and talk about how literature is a game that is played between the reader and the author. So this is how my pedagogy operates, and I'm using a host of literary, non-literary texts to actually try and reach my student in the way he can be reached. Because if I just read out the poem and explain it to him and ask him to take notes, then I might be doing a job in preparing him for the exams, but I am not really critically asking him to think. Right. This is not something which I'll go into, but this is incidentally, we discuss the plague through the paintings through the figures of Dunstall. This, by the way, is the last part of that series of narrative paintings. This is incidentally a series of narrative paintings where a painting tells the story of the plague, right? From the beginnings of the plague to the end of the plague. This, by the way, is where the death becomes maximum, and this is the return. Hopefully someday, we can be painting our own return to normalcy very soon. Now comes this question of the digital humanities, and this is something which I've been doing recently a lot. You see, allowing them access to resources which are beyond me. So this, for example, is the Yale University resource for 18th century studies. And these are some things which the UGC now has given us. Therefore, you have the 18th century collections online. So I'm asking them to take a look at how, say, for example, Blake's The Tiger was in manuscript form. So taking a look at the manuscripts, taking a look at pictures, often helps them to understand and situate the text in a certain way. So these are the resources that I'm using nowadays. For example, those who work on Tagore, for example, know how work on taking a look at the manuscripts of Tagore and the doodles that he makes gets us to understand how art functions within Tagore as a holistic category, that pictures, images, rhythm, all this is integrally tied with the written word. So that is one of the ways in which I sort of try and bring the digital humanities into the purview of my teaching. You can, of course, take also a look at the online courses that are offered, some by the UGC, interestingly, there are courses like the MOOCs, the SWAYAM. I, of course, use a lot of this particular website called Coursera, which interestingly uses, has very, very pointed courses with interactive quizzes, because you see, at the end of the day, we are technically challenged people. And your college will not give you the technology, or my university will not give me the technology to actually conduct quizzes, to actually have very professionally made videos. So why not let them access certain free courses? Coursera, for example, has a brilliant course in the modern and the postmodern, where you have 14-minute videos and you move from one module to the other. There are courses on, say, for example, the classical literatures. It's very difficult. You see, the CBCS syllabus, for example, talks about Iliad and the Odyssey and the Metamorphoses. How are you going to teach them in a matter of 6 months? How are you going to talk to them about the classical world? Could we, together as teachers, watch such a course? Ask them that this is the time in which we will all be taking a look at these courses. You see, we are, after all, scrambling right now. And given the pandemic, the scramble has become even more. Now, I understand here that the digital divide is there. Some students might be left out. But once again, the point is to get in as much as you can. And when the university or the classes resume, as they will, to back them up with actual displays. Now, of course, many of you have faced this question with the visually challenged students. I have 2 of them in every semester almost nowadays. So we have incorporated, audible books, audio books. We incorporate technologies like the JAWS. This is a technology which reads books out. So this is something which we pull through the library, through the resources of the department. This you can ask your library, college library, to purchase also a one-time license, which helps them through audible books. Nowadays, you have Kindle books, you have Audible, which is a series which has come out, Spotify, for example, which we can use. And this is how, technology, not very difficult technology, can be accessed and makes, and this is where technology, I think, is very important in allowing a level playing field for certain visually challenged people. It is important that PowerPoint presentations be heard. Now, this question about the visual then becomes a little problematic. So you have to adjust. If there is a visually challenged student, then maybe I would move on to music rather than a particular visual within the textual parameter of the class. Now, this is my fundamentally last slide. When the pandemic broke out, I was struggling. Initially, I took classes by WhatsApp. I recorded those lectures and sent them in separate files. But then I found out that, the visual quantity was absolutely missing. But there were students who could access only WhatsApp. There were students who were comfortable with recordings. And there were students who wanted that visual content. So what I've now done is, I take classes on Google Meet. I ask students, I dedicate a particular student to record that class. They are technically far more advanced. They record it and send it over to their classmates via Telegram. So that, or WhatsApp, whatever. So that's an audio which I'm providing to them. And I've started my YouTube channel as well. As you can see here, this is the text that I'm teaching now, right? It's MacFleckno, and I've broken it up into, say, 10 classes. I have a class on, say, Dryden, Original and Progress of Satire, which interestingly is in your CBCS course. If you're interested, you can visit this channel. I'll give you the link shortly. So I have 2 classes on this. I read the text. For undergraduate students, I never do without the text. I make a selection, I read the text with them, point out the relevant sections, upload the class immediately onto YouTube, so that those who want to listen to the class once again can have a look at it, right? And this is technology which is not dependent upon one single LMS. So your college has fixed an LMS. Tomorrow your LMS provider says, no, thank you very much, I'm terminating the contract. Your college is not paying. That server is not operating. It is always important for us to go to technology which is person independent. And therefore I use Google and the YouTube as a mode. You can use your Facebook as well. But the problem with Facebook is that Facebook lectures cannot be recorded and uploaded elsewhere, or if they can be, I lack the technology. I'm more of a teacher rather than a technical expert. So this is what I've done: Dryden's Life and Times. So original and progressive satire, Life and Times, and then we talk about the poem in, say, 4 lectures. And then I have a broad discussion. So this is the question all of you were asking. Will the teacher disappear? No. The teacher doesn't disappear, but the teacher is also in a certain way digitized. He remains there, and it is important, I think, in the Indian context. This particular YouTube channel was my effort to bring the teacher and the experience close to the student. So this is what is the approximate digital version of what I was just before the pandemic broke out. Now, there is a problem with these videos also, because they are full classes, full 40 to 50 minute odd classes. Now, what I'm thinking about, and this I have not started, is I've been looking at these online courses, and I see that the span of the student in watching a video is probably at a max of 15 minutes. So what I'm probably going to do now is not to make these 45, 50 minute videos, but truncate them to a 15-minute version and upload it on YouTube. When this is stage 2, when they are used to the digital media. Now, as you can see, I've been asking my students repeatedly, some of them have been impacted by the floods in North Bengal, whether they have been able to access it. This is very important. Feedback. They might not watch the digital, the YouTube videos, but it's imperative that they listen to the audios. So there are sections, say for example, when I've taught MacFleckno, I'll have 2 classes where I allow them to present, and I then individually follow up with students whether they have accessed this or whether they have got access to whatever resources we have sent. This is the process that I follow. That is all that I could do with my limited abilities. I once again am confessing that I have shared my hesitations and confusions and the ways in which I have coped with this. I am now extremely interested to know what and how you have coped with. Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Dr. Amrit Sen, sir. I am actually taken away from the world where I was, and you have merged all these different areas in such a pragmatic and useful way. Not only the questions that are important in teaching literary topics like canons of literature, because we have all loved teaching of literature, and specifically poetry, as you gave the examples from Pope and Blake and Romantic poets, and how in a very radical way we are thrown into this digital virtual world, and in a way we are forced to use all these methodologies. by way of social media or blogs and PPT and all these methodologies of teaching via virtual machinery. So I was really wondering, we often ask a question again and again whether a machine can replace a teacher, and we always find the ultimate obvious answer that the machine cannot replace a teacher. So though we use all these things as tools and techniques, the worry and the concern of a literature teacher that you expressed, and then you also offered multiple suggestions and multiple possibilities and solutions to deal with them. It was a very, very wonderful lecture. I found it so nice, and it was like a feast. I don't know what point I should pick up to talk to you now, because you have stuffed all the important areas of discussion in this one talk, and reserving myself, because I'm already a teacher and I would have time to talk to you via email and other modes. I would give this time to the participants and ask them to have their queries to discuss with you one by one. So let me ask, because participants have thoroughly enjoyed your session, and I have seen many comments, so many questions and queries poured in the chat box here. Yes, so let us begin with Dhritiman, because Dhritiman already knows you, and I think he has something relevant he was putting there in the chat box. Dhritiman, can you ask your query or offer your comment?
Yes. I'm not adding to the appreciation already. You know, we all know what Amrita is capable of, and it was expected rather for at least for me. Amrita, particularly the phrase that used, comparative cultural studies. I did my PhD on social movements, where I applied, some methodologies from cultural studies, and this is a personal experience rather than a question straight away. I talked about Shingur movement there, where I used various, folk materials which were there in the Shingur. So the main question for me was that when we approach certain movements through social science registers, usual social science registers, what are the things we miss out? For example, we didn't pay any heed to the fact that Shingur had a very lively and, history, various folk, traditions there, which were used during the movement. So I just, brought those things out. Now, when I go to, for interview to a literature department, the first question that I face is that, how is your work relevant for English literature? Because you are dealing with issues which are not taught about in the in literature department. So what are the texts you are using? And and it's a very difficult for me to explain that, look, I didn't use fictional text, but I did use, these are the already text. But then, certain structures, certain presupposition that we have in the literature department, which often, become very significant hindrance for us. So this is the first question, how to overcome these issues. Second is, since you are talking about expanding, the scope of literature by incorporating so many issues, my just humble question would be that, would you also, would you also agree to the fact that we also need to discuss some other, very seminal text while talking about Indian literature? For example, Srinivas' work on Rampura, the kind of ethnography that he had. Or, for example, Partha Chatterjee's works on fragments. And because you spoke about feminism, why should we not also include that text by Partha Chatterjee, where he is talking about how, the fragments and the nation and its fragments? Or for example, Ranojit Kaur's text while talking about Arundhati Roy's God of Small Things. So would you also, push a little further in saying that these are the, texts from political science, let's say from sociology, which we also need to incorporate while talking about Indian literature? So these are the two roughly questions.
Right. Can I answer, Dr. Verma?
Yes, please, sir.
Right. Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Dhritiman. The problem with literature departments has been that, you see, university departments are only producing same PhDs. You see, you have either Amitabh Ghosh's work, or I get PhDs from all around India. I have something right now called the metaphysical elements in Shakespeare's tragedies. So we have, as you say, large parts of the Indian academia have failed to incorporate theoretical debates into undergraduate teaching. I'm not talking about university teaching. Professor Verma will agree that universities have become almost exclusive spaces where you can do a lot of experimentation. But at undergraduate colleges, it's largely becoming, text, examination, and with the semester nowadays, you do not even get the time to explain, right? So critical thinking, which was the aim of the humanities, if you go back to that term, studia humanitatis, right? The framing of the mind, the framing of the self has all but disappeared, right? I entirely agree with you. And secondly, for example, in my department, I almost always do not encourage students to work on literature. My the last thesis that I've supervised was on football as represented in various literary texts from India. It's very interesting to see how that happens, but that is at the research level. For example, we've asked people to work on how the Constituent Assembly debates were part of framing the discourse on nation. This is something, Dhitiman, that unfortunately, as I said, we are very colonial about the discipline, right? I have seen questions in the chat box that, whether we can allow a discussion in a regional language within the English classroom. And, there have been many colleagues who've told me that, you're spoiling the children by not allowing them to, their English is getting sort of ruffled or not developed. Now, the point is, somebody who is just crawling, you can't ask him to run. You have to get him up to a certain level. So yes, I agree with you with your first question. As regards the second question, you see, I am a little hesitant here. At the undergraduate level, if you throw too much theory at a student, then there is a chance of being overwhelmed, right? Given the constraints in which we work under, I think it is very important that it be done very subtly. That is why I referred to my experiment with the rape of the lock and see, certain points that could be made. If I start throwing texts like Partha Chatterjee at them and force them to read it, they might be slightly overwhelmed. This is where I think at the undergraduate level, the role of the teacher as a nurturer becomes very important.
Yes.
Right. This could be taken on to people or to students who are more interested. Because Dhitiman, you have to agree, and I am sure Professor Verma will also agree with me, that there's a percentage of students who will go on to do this, but there's a percentage of students who will not want to do this. Right, and you have to take this entire class along. You can't just think of one particular segment. Right.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you so much.
Actually, there is so much about the issues we are talking of. But again, I would reserve my comments because I don't want to take up participants' time. And I would call Sulipta. Sulipta wants to comment on something.
Sir, I was absolutely fascinated by your lecture. Sir, I think I had heard about the flipped classroom technique, but the way you demonstrated it right away, I think that's really worthy of emulation. Absolutely, the way you introduced some concepts and you raised questions. I think that's a wonderful way how we can get about teaching literature to our students. And I think the way you actually introduce some vital concepts or questions which are present in the humanities discipline, as against the other subjects like science and technology. The very the ethics which govern the humanities discipline, I think those are the concepts which actually differentiate the literature, the study of literature from the other subjects. I think the way you actually introduce these concepts, I think it was absolutely amazing.
Yeah, it was very, very unparalleled, really. There is a candidate, sir, our participants, Annapurna, who has a very relevant question. She had written in chat box. Annapurna, can you read your question? Yes, Annapurna.
The contrapuntal learning
Yes.
that
Yes.
she was asking. Yes.
Yes, sir.
You see, I was talking about the ways in which the visual and the textual sort of combine to make a narrative. You see, the point that I was trying to make, Annapurna, was that what does art do? You know, these are basic questions. Thank you, Shulipta, also for making this point. It's important, you know, to understand what the humanities is. We very often launch into it without really telling the students what we want to do. Now, all art, be it the visual form or the music, tries to tell us something, tries to communicate in a certain way, right? But very often the painting also is trying to tell us what, you know, what change is being brought about in the way at which we are looking at reason, for example. Now, if you take a look at that painting by Blake, then you are taking a look at the way in which, you know, reason is seen as this Urizen-like figure, the shrunken old man who's trying to sort of bring the world within a particular rigid formal structure of the circle, right? So restricting man's abilities within one particular ambit. Now, once again, therefore, what does Romanticism do? Protest against it. And then you read something like, say, the lyrical ballads, and you see how Wordsworth is trying to break open the ballad structure and the lyric structure and bringing a whole new range of poetry through metrical revelations, through certain formal changes, right? You take a look at, say, Lamb's Dream Children, where you see how the dream and the reality are being continuously superimposed in a way in which reality, the concept of reality, can be extended. And then maybe we can take this from that particular age to an age, say, like Salman Rushdie's, and we can see how magical realism takes on this experiment forward, right? And then what I normally do is then I talk about the Russian formalists and their concept of how genres and forms become deadened, and then comes a way in which they become revitalized. And then go back to this concept of the history of literature and how literature is sort of, why do we study histories of literature? To see movements and ways in which storytelling becomes, undergoes a change. So when I talk about contrapuntal teaching or contrapuntal learning, I'm talking about, you know, bringing in various issues from various parts of storytelling. It might be form, in the sense that music and literature are interacting, or art and literature are interacting, or it might also be periods, you know, different periods and the ways in which storytelling or narrative has changed. That is what I meant, right? Contrapuntal in the sense bringing the various together.
Thank you, sir. Rakesh wants to say something. Yes, Rakesh.
Thank you, ma'am. Dr. Sain, it was truly engaging, sir. I could really connect with the method that you brought to on poetry and how you used other sorts of visual mediums and other sorts of, let's say, the paintings, all these aspects. So one observation which I also wanted to make while I was teaching, I remember having taught one poetry by Tagore, and that is Colored Toys. It
Right.
was very picturesque. It's almost a Blake sort of image, but students couldn't understand because the stanzas had a limited ending. And then on an experimental basis, I just used John Carpenter's rendition of Colored Toys, and when they heard the rendition, and then when they read it, they started enjoying it more, they understood it more. And on the second part, another poetry by Maya Angelou,
Mm.
and her poetry by poetry that is Phenomenal Woman. So this poetry, which was read plainly, they couldn't appreciate more. But when one student offered to rap on Maya Angelou's poetry, and when that student did, another offered a beat. So the entire class atmosphere changed, and then they were looking forward to more such poetry. So I clearly understand why they were able to, because you were able to give us a picturesque view, and it's a synesthetic quality of offering different senses and connecting all of them and converging them to the written words. Sir, really brilliant, sir.
Right.
Thank
Thank you. I absolutely, this is something, what the mobile phone has allowed us to do. You see, if you, but the problem is, Rakesh, that you see, there's so much there. So as a teacher, if you can facilitate and show them what that could be done, and allow them to experience that on the mobile phone. You see, earlier we had this question of a smart classroom and a projector and so on and so forth. Now you can cut across that through technology.
Exactly.
So that is something which I entirely agree. But for that, what needs to be done is to change the way in which we approach pedagogy. And that is where I think the relevance of this refresher course would actually lie.
Yes, sir, you are very right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Rakesh. Jaishri wants to say something. Jaishri Bhattacharya.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, sir, for such elaborating speech that you have given. It was a wonderful lecture, sir. I just wanted to ask you one thing, that being the students of English literature, should we teach them the literatures from other languages as well? And if yes, then will it be known as English literature still after that, or it will be like only literature? Or
Well, you've hit the nail on the head, really. That was my first question. You see, English literature, as you know, was not taught to English people. It was primarily taught to us, we are essentially children of Macaulay. In that sense of the term, the English all learned Greek and Latin prior to this. So the question is, once again, you have to ask yourself, what are you teaching? Are you giving them English skills? Then it's always better to go in for English as a foreign language, what the CFL does. But if you are actually asking them to read literature as an expression of culture and their realities, then I think it is important for us to get them to read other literatures as well. Now, we have done this. For example, there's a paper in the CVCS called Detective Fiction, right? I don't know whether you have taught it. I'm sure at some point of time you'll be doing this. Now, what I've done is, there's Wilkie Collins, for example, there's Arthur Conan Doyle. There's a 30% margin for change where I have put in the Byomkesh Bokshi stories, for example. Right. Now, the Byomkesh Bokshi stories have been translated. So it is easier for me. Right. Where these texts have not been translated, we have tried to translate these texts and bring it in. because there's always going to be a few students in your class will not know the regional language. You can't leave them out.
Yeah.
But I think it is important for us to also engage in this process of translation, bring in the literatures that are part of our realities so that we can make sense of what this literature is going to do. Now, I can't do that with an 18th century text, can I? Right? But I can do that with a vast majority of the part of the syllabus. You see, even in America, Shakespeare papers have been dropped. But if you want to do that in India, people will kill you. Right? You can't be, you go for interviews, there's one question which is going to be like on Macbeth. I've seen people in school interviews where I've been part of the board saying, oh, you haven't read Shakespeare, you don't know English. Right? I'm sharing my experiences. That's what often happens.
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
So, but if we think that as literature teachers, we need critical thinking, relationship of language with how language constructs the world, then translation and bringing in these as part of our syllabi is imperative. That's my opinion, of course. Right.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Jayashree. Because you mentioned translation, sir, now I'm not able to stop myself. Apart from these use of technology and use of media and making it an instrumental kind of tool in doing the job as a teacher, I often used to feel that virtual classroom or digital teaching is not really tempting because human contact is so lively, and I come from that old school of I'm the product of that, even you are, but you have blended yourself so very well with the new upcoming techno world. And I was just thinking, because you mentioned translation, in teaching the paper of translation, I found that people who are tempted to use Google translation, and we find it is very ridiculous many a times. So how it will take a long time for machines to come up to human levels and to have that much resource in the machine, because we are finally feeding all the resource. So an example that I found, my student gave me from Google translation. He said a sentence, say no to alcohol. Say no to alcohol was produced by Google as sharab se kuch mat kehna.
True, true, absolutely, madam. And you see,
yes,
sorry, please.
That was one of the examples, but I found that there is a lot of series of challenges that we are facing. Not only updating ourselves in the techno expected orientation or reorientation, but also the things that we are missing out, the things that we are diluting, and the things that we are trying to adjust, and sometimes to the level of compromise, which creates a lot of dissatisfaction in a person like me, because I don't feel very happy with the blog teaching or virtual teaching, and I always want my students to come face to face and give the answers and imagine, rather than having ready-made audio visuals. They should imagine, read the novel, that touch of the page of the book, everything. So I was just thinking how people whom we call smart generation, and now we are forced to become a smart generation because of the lockdown, we don't have any option. Unwillingly or whatever, we are doing the same thing which younger generation was happily doing so far. So there is a lot of gap to be bridged. Yes. And my worry and concern is how teachers are going to do this. It's a huge responsibility.
Right.
What do you think, sir?
I think, madam, you're absolutely right. In regards translation, I'll tell you my experience. Yes. Earlier, we used to do something called critical appreciation, if you remember, madam, of a poem. Now, the first years, they used to come and I would give them small poems. And I'd ask them to translate them into their own language.
Yes.
And when they did that, I used to ask them, what are the problems that you faced?
Yeah.
And it is there that we would open up this question of how, style operates, how themes can be translated through figures of speech. That would be a wonderful experience. That has somehow disappeared from the CBSE syllabus, which I think is a great problem. We're just thrusting, novice students into reading, say, literary texts right at the beginning without any form of initiation. I think that needs to be done, one. And
Exactly.
secondly, you are absolutely right, but the problem is, and we see our children, at least I can see my daughter, the quantum of reading and the quantum of consuming visual content has
Yeah.
changed.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
very often I am referred to as almost a dinosaur nowadays,
Yeah.
right? So, but the problem is that the policy making is with us. But the
Yes.
realities are with the younger people. So it is very important for us to have this dialogue as to
Yes.
where we can come to a kind of a,
Middle way.
middle way, a path.
Yes.
And as I said, I'm searching. I really have no answers to that.
But you suggested all the possibilities so beautifully, and it was like I found that you were actually ready with the answers. So that's really a very, very good talk, sir. I'm so happy all the participants have thoroughly enjoyed, and I want to personally thank you that you accepted my word. We have never met before, but Dr. Sudhir could connect us, and I had heard about you, and I'm so happy that I could listen to you today. And maybe after the lockdown is over, we will call you physically to visit Mumbai University, and I will look forward for such an occasion any time in future. And before I sum up the session, let me ask, sir, with your permission, one of the participants to offer the formal vote of thanks. Asha?
Madam, just before that, could I just have
Yes,
one
sir.
minute?
Yes, sir, please, please.
I've posted in the chat box my
Yes.
experiments with YouTube. May
Yeah.
I request my peers here to go through that YouTube channel once, and if you have any suggestions through which I can improve it, in the sense
Yes.
that if I need to truncate my videos, make them shorter, please do let me know, because I am in the same boat with you, and your opinions will be very valuable to me. Thank you, madam.
Yes, sir, surely. I would spread this link also in my students. It is going to be useful, I'm sure. Yes,
Thank you.
Asha? Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you, ma'am, for the space. Good afternoon, all. At the outset itself, let me thank Dr. Amrit Sen for his eloquent take on transitions and aporias. The questions that you reflected at the outset itself was an amazing premise to your lecture. The way you blended different areas to generate critical thinking in students is truly spellbound, sir. The solutions you offered were really food for thought. On behalf of UGC HRDC Mumbai and all the participants present, I extend a heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Amrit Sen for the engaging lecture. Thank you, sir. We are really indebted to Bhagyashree ma'am for making this possible. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you, sir. It was a pleasure to meet you online. And as I said, we will always look forward for the future meeting.
Thank you, ma'am, for everything, and thank you, everybody, for your patient hearing.
Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Thank you.
Okay, bye. Let me talk to you, dear participants. Everybody is here.
Yes, ma'am.
Please come
Yes,
to
ma'am.
your video mode.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, because I was really doubting whether some people are already hungry and have you gone for lunch already. Okay. So one quick announcement before we go for the break, because this is relevant to what I experienced today in the morning 2 sessions. Before we go to a lunch break, just quickly, I want to tell you something. In the very first beginning of the day, Let me just wait one minute. I'm talking to you about something which is very important.